Alrighty, apologies for everybody having to watch me do nothing. Lucky I'm the only one in the room. So this stream, we are going to start producing the world's best. Alrighty, apologies for. Okay, so the world's best yacht risk management list. That's it. And the way we're going to do that is just week by week go through and show everybody how to do risk management. And I'm going to show you how I do it. I work in medical devices, so I'm going to use that sort of framework. It's similar to a lot of other frameworks, works pretty well. And we're going to explain, go into detail and produce a massive list of risks over the coming weeks and months and hopefully years, which the community can use as a resource for their own boats. So in the chat, in the description, there is a link to a Google Sheet. You can click it and request it. I'll give you access. You'll have to share your email. I'm not going to spam you or anything. It's just security to protect the sheet. You can copy it, save it, whatever. And well, you've got my email on the page, so you can contact me there. That's me. I do two things. I've got this channel, Kosh ADV, which is sort of a general boating channel, more of a hobby channel. And then I've got Yacht Prep, which is my yacht readiness software. So if you want to support me, you can subscribe to Yacht Prep. I'll help you set it up. It's basically for ensuring your boat's ready for whatever you want to do. And risk management doesn't mean you're ready, but it helps you get ready. Same as maintenance. A maintained boat is not necessarily a ready boat, and we can go into that too at some point. Right. So with no further ado, let's get into it. Right, what are we going to do? So we're going to choose a topic tonight. Let's call it a category. And the category is fire. So in our little spreadsheet here, we're going to write category. Now, a little bit of a problem because my big head is a bit in the way. So I'm just going to move it there. Right. Okay. So this will be our little heading row. Unfortunately, if this goes well, I can build a application, a database, which is even better, where people can contribute. But we'll start here like this now. And let me just freeze the first row. Right, so category, fire. There it is, fire. Now, I'm going to create a subcategory. Why would Richard create a subcategory? Because there is the fire starting, right? And then there is the fire extinguishing or ending. Right, now these are two different things. So fire, for example, what are the elements of fire? Fire needs a spark, fuel, and oxygen to get started. So easy, right? We just got to make sure that you don't have all of those three things in one space together. And generally the issue is the spark, because fuel and oxygen are generally abundant, especially on a motorboat. And what we're going to do here is do some wrapping. Apologies about this, guys, because on the first stream, we are going to be setting this up. Right. So, and then we got fire extinguishing. It's a pretty bad name. And so that's effectively removing fuel or oxygen. So fire stops burning. If we got any firemen on the call, then please do let us know. I've done some fire training over the years, in some guiding experience, in some yacht training. I did some security during COVID because it was I just had to do it, which was a great experience. I love the job. Did some fire training with that. I've been a fire officer, for work in, the office, these sort of things. I'm sure we've all done stuff like that. However, I'm not going to say I am the best fire person in the world, as you will tell. Right. So here's the first lesson. A lot of people think that, fire is a category and I just have to manage fire as a risk generally. That's not quite how it works. You could say, well, okay, now we've got two subcategories, so we're good, right? So we've got a category of stopping the fire starting, and then can you say starting the fire stopping? So basically, make sure it doesn't start, and if it does start, make sure you can stop it, right? So again, that's not going to be specific enough for our purposes because, as you'll see, there's thousands of different ways on your boat how a fire can start. And there are thousands of different ways how your fire could potentially stop or not stop, which we'll get on to too. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just move this down a little bit here. And we are going to create another column called hazardous situation. Right. So this describes the events on how the risk will become live or could come live because it's all probability, right? It's actually the hazardous situation that helps us become very tight and very clear on ensuring that all of these risks are mitigated. And well, prevented is best, but secondarily, if it does start, we do have a way of stopping it. Right. So what I'm going to do now is show you an ISO. Many people will have seen these things. Let me just make sure you can see it on the screen. Is that going to do it? Okay, I have a little bit of an issue here with my sharing. Why is that not going to? There we go. Good. Okay. So this is an ISO, an international standard from the International Standard Organization. That's what ISO stands for. And this is the standards for medical devices, which is the industry I work in when I'm not working in boats, and application of risk management to medical devices. Now, as you probably know, anything medical, pharma, there's always a risk-benefit trade-off. And, unfortunately for all these devices, pharmaceutical devices, medical devices, for a lot of them there is a potential benefit, but there's also a potential risk. And as a patient, you may or may not be informed, but there's a risk to everything. Now, what we want to do in yachting, we want to make sure that our mitigation is strong. We don't want anybody to get hurt or anybody to die. Unfortunately, medical devices, there is an acceptable rate of death, which they have to, manufacturers have to come up with a number. So unlike what we, don't want in our boats, we don't want anybody hurt. This industry, unfortunately, there is an acceptable injury and death rate, which is a bit of a morbid fact, but it's one of these things where, lots of different factors, and there are some companies better than others, but it's just unfortunately a fact of life. Now, I'm not really going to go through all this in detail. We'll have a look at this in parts. As we go through this series, we'll have a look at other risk ISOs and other risk frameworks that can be used. You don't have to use this one. I work with this one a lot. I really like it. I find it very useful for my boat and also, obviously for my profession. And okay, we scroll down. Again, we're not really going to look at this right now, but what I'm looking for is, I'm just going to do a search. Hazardous situation. There we go. We've got, looks like 26 references to hazardous situation and 41 references to hazardous situations, plural. So if we just go through, now we're in section 3, these are the definitions. So the definition is um, circumstances in which people, property, or the environment are exposed to one or more hazards. So we will look at the Annex C for the relationship between hazard and hazardous situation. Now, these are really, really important definitions to help get that mental framework, because the list will only be useful if we all sort of understand on the sort of the framework, the philosophy, the meaning of each of the columns and why it's important. So, we all have a natural understanding of risk. Don't go near the fire, you get burnt. But there's a very formal, structured way to look at risk management, which gives us even more ability to analyze the situation and to, like I said, prevent it or mitigate it. So we'll come back to that in a moment. I'm just going to write down Annex C and we'll come back to that. All right, Annex C. Right, so we've got hazardous situation. So let's have a look at what the hazard is, which, surprise, surprise, here it is. Potential source of harm. So again, a hazard doesn't mean that you are going to get harmed. So falling off a cliff is a potential hazard, but as long as you stay away from the edge, you're probably not going to fall, right? So it's all potential. Means it could happen, which we'll see later, means there's a probabilistic outcome between 0 and 100% in the worst case. And we never want the 100%, we want closer to the 0. And you can see here we've got another italicized word, harm, which is a defined term here. Harm: injury or damage to the health of people, or damage to the property, or damage to the environment. So here, damage to health of a person, a crew member. It could be anything from mental stress. So people can get traumatized on boats when they feel unsafe for long periods of time, or they fear in the risk of their life. These sort of things, near-death events, for example, like nearly drowning or overboard and maybe spending hours in the water until somebody eventually finds them. So these, maybe they survive physically okay. You've got mental trauma. So mental stress, mental trauma is a harm we need to look at, and that can go from cut finger, a bruise, to losing a limb, to permanent disabilities, all the way to death, right? So we'll look at that later. That's part of risk management, to look at the severity. But people is one of the core aspects we need to look at in the hazardous situation. Now, property, where the property is exposed to one or more hazards. Now, with boats, they're usually big, expensive objects which weigh single, double digit, triple digit tons. Very heavy, expensive objects which are mobile. So that damage could be that very heavy, expensive boat. It could be damage to the property of people on board the boat. It could be damage to other people's boats or other property as well, such as the the marina. You name it. You can all guess as much as I. So property is obviously a key concern in yachting, and then we got the environment. So we're in water, in the air. We're on that margin between water and air. So, oil spills, sewerage, things that go overboard is potentially damage to the environment, especially, worst case, a boat catches on fire, there's a big oil leak, it can be quite bad. And, air pollution as well, potentially. So these are things we need to consider. I'd probably say here, for the environment, by the time things have gone wrong on a boat, at least the big things like burning or sinking, the environment's probably the last thing we're, thinking about. So we're probably worried first about people and property. And if you look after the people and the property, then the environment is going to be fine. There is other things there. We see a lot more regulations on having holding tanks, for example, whereas before you could just pump your domestic waste over the side. Now, if you're in inshore waters, close to shore, you're meant to keep it on your boat. I know a lot of people kind of don't. but that's meant to be for the environment. And then more and more, well, I think somewhat to the detriment of the industry, we're seeing these very fuel efficient engines which have a lot of electronics to get that efficiency. And unfortunately, they're more complicated. When they break down, they can be hard to fix because often it's electronics problem. And so you could argue going from environment back to, the safety of people and property. I would think there's an argument to say that the environmental laws actually make boating more unsafe. So I've got a Gardner 8-cylinder diesel from about 1972 on my boat, big old thing. You could run it with a lot of crap through the engine. You can run it, shut down individual cylinders. It's all mechanical. Once you get it started, you've got an electric starter, get the rotations you need for the engine to catch. But after that, it's just pure diesel mechanics at that point. So no complicated electronics to break down, and it's even possible to hand start it with 8-cylinder. You need two people to start it. So I think 6 and 4 cylinders, one person can start it. So you can argue there that, but I guess it's by modern standards, it's probably not a very environmentally friendly engine, although the fuel efficiency is wonderful on it. It's actually, I think, gives you it's a lot more reliable, safer engine for longer runs. Right. So potential source of harm, right? So harm, there we got that. So we're going to stop there. We're going to look at the hazardous situation because that's where it gets a bit fun. So let's just search through here. Right. So if we go through here, we've already started doing this. So section 5, the risk analysis process. So the first start of the process is the intended use, and reasonably foreseeable misuse. Now this is really critical. So I'm writing a book on readiness, and one of my arguments in that book is that your boat is never ready by itself. You always have to look at the purpose of the boat and what it's being put for. And I did a video recently where I argued that imagine you've got 3 identical boats, identical in every way. One's just got to sit on a cradle for winter in the boatyard. One's going to do like a day trip mile offshore, and the other one's doing an ocean crossing. Same boat, but potentially not equally ready because that use of the boat, in this case, intended use, it's we use that in the medical device industry. You can, I think it's pretty clear term, how do you want to use your boat? How do you intend to use your boat? That's how you use it. So there are different sort of, hazards for a boat: inland waters versus coastal waters versus offshore versus, crossing the oceans. And then foreseeable misuse. So how can that be done? So reasonably foreseeable misuse. So we're on page 10. I am going to come back here to find the, let's see, is it defined here? Reasonable misuse. There we go. Definition 3.15. Use of a product or a system. Okay, just substitute yacht there. Not intended by the manufacturer. In that case would be your boat designer and boatyard, but which can result from a readily predictable human behavior. So readily predictable human behavior includes behavior of all types of users, lay and professional users. So an amateur captain, professional captain, an amateur crew, professional crew, for example. So what is reasonably foreseeable misuse? So we can dive into this probably in another call, but for example, people forget, right? People forget to do things. So, potentially a reasonable foreseeable misuse is somebody starts the engine without opening the seacock, right? I'm sure that happens every day on a yacht. What could another one be? Yeah, starting the engine potentially. If you need, like in my engine room, I've got like a ventilation fan which brings air into the engine room. I do have a control on that, so the engine won't start unless that fan is turned on. But forgetting to turn on that fan is reasonably foreseeable misuse, right? We're all human; we make mistakes. And if you've seen my discussion on checklists, my argument there is even the most professional, the most experienced sailor, captain, crew member, should be using checklists, especially for critical procedures, because memory is a completely false friend. It really doesn't help you. You know, it's easy to forget. And the checklist there, it's something that we can just verify our memory against. And, you know, we always learn and we can always update the checklist. So, you know, for example, one thing we'll see later on we get here, and it's something we can build out in my app, Yacht Prep, which hopefully we get to at, you know, some point, where, um, yeah, where we can build a set of checklists, which again, everybody can use. And, you know, let's build the world's best checklist. I think that could be another interesting subset of this series. Right. So let's go back to the process. We'll come back to that later. Right. So intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuse. So the manufacturer, so in this case, we're going to replace manufacturer with the owner or the captain. I'll just say owner from now on. The owner shall document the intended use of the particular, I'm not going to use medical device, I'm going to use yacht being considered. The the intended use should take into account information such as, right, okay, so here you got the intended medical indication. And again, we're not talking about medical device here, but this is important, right? So a Band-Aid is a medical device. That Band-Aid sits on outside the skin, usually for wounds which are not overly serious wounds, like a little scratch or an abrasion, these sort of things. If it's any more serious than that requires stitches or surgery, you know, use other sort of wound dressings. So the intended, in this case, we can say the use of the yacht. So it could be, you know, going out fishing for a couple of hours. It could be inland waterways of Europe. It could be a lake boat, coastal, ocean going. It could be a fast boat. It could be a racing boat. It could be a cruising yacht. It could be a racing yacht. You know, these sort of things. You know, the intended use can vary, and that's really important. So if you have a look at some of these high-speed Americans Cup catamarans, these hydrofoiling catamarans, right? They all wear helmets because they're so fast, these boats, that if they do nosedive, people get thrown off, whatever they hit their head, it's potentially threatening. Where if you have a look at like the I forgot now, Mum 30s, you know, sort of more of these one design yachts, or, you know, even 18-foot skiffs, for example, you generally don't see people wearing helmets. Although as an ex 12-foot skiff sailor years ago, I would probably advise it, to be honest. And even on, you know, yachts with that boom swinging around, potentially helmets could be a thing. There's an idea. Let's build a sailing helmet company. So yeah, all those sort of things are important. And then, you know, we can subset that a bit too. So do you intend to sail it or tend to motor it? Because if you intend to sail it, you tend to sail it downwind and jibe, for example. That boom that swings around high velocity has, you know, a lot of potential hazard related to it. Right, patient population. Now, paid population, part of the body or type, right? So again, this is a little bit medical device. We'll probably ignore the type of tissue because, you know, if you're doing brain surgery or you're doing, you know, like an abrasion after a skateboard accident, these are two different types of things. Dealing with the heart, a kidney, you know, you name it. These are all different parts of the body or tissue type which have their different risk associated with it. However, here it says patient population. So the patient population in this case would be the population the medical device is being used on. So we can substitute patient population for the yacht crew. So this could be, or basically anybody who interacts with the yacht. So it could be, you know, the captain, the crew. It could be anybody who goes on board for maintenance or servicing, for example. So, you know, if there's an electrical hazard on board, like a live wire that could electrocute anybody on board, and that's equally applicable to people who go on board just to service it, as it is for, you know, crew members who sail the boat. So as we get into the risk management, we'll see us segregate on these sort of things more. User profile. So again, the user, again, medical device, this can be, the user could be a doctor or it could be a patient. So if you're doing a urine test at home, the patient is the user, so they're the same person. Or, if it's a doctor using a surgical knife, the user would be the doctor and the patient would be the person getting cut by the knife. Use environment, we've already, touched on this a little bit. It's a use environment, sitting in the harbour, sitting on the stand, in the river, etc. I think you get that idea. And operating principle. So here, different medical devices have different operating principles. Radiology, I said, knives, band-aids, silicone gels, heart pumps, diabetes systems. They all have very different operating principles. But here for us, we can probably look at probably the main group would be, is it a motorboat, sailing boat, high-speed boat, low-speed boat, racing, not racing, these sort of things. Again, this doesn't map necessarily all one-to-one, but useful as a framework nonetheless. So the manufacturer will also document reasonably foreseeable misuse. We've sort of touched on that a little bit. We'll dive that later. And this document shall be maintained in the risk management file. Now that is a really good idea. And when I bought my boat, Sex Pilot boat, there was an operating manual from the Harbour Authority that had it. They didn't really have a risk management file as such, but it'd be very worthwhile to have a risk management file on your boat, or take the spreadsheet we're going to build and do it for your boat. And at some point, probably not this year, hopefully next year in Yacht Prep, we'll build risk management into the software. So, you can be fully integrated with your engineering as well. So identification of characteristics related to safety. That's a step. We're going to start doing that today. Not really, I don't think we'll go into that. It's going to get a bit of a medical device risk manager lecture if I carry on this way. So here we go. Identify of hazards and hazardous situations. Right. So this is kind of what we started to do. Manufacturer shall identify and document known and foreseeable hazards associated with the medical device based on the intended use, reasonably foreseeable misuse, and the characteristics related to safety. So, okay, so how do we crack this one open? We've kind of started that a little bit here. We've got like a hazard category, fire, right? A hazard category, a fire starting or not being able to stop. So these are two. So we kind of started the hazard identification. Shall identify and document the resulting hazardous situations. So I think that could be the best place to go now. So what I want to go to is Annex C, I think it was. Right, here we go. So we're in the Appendix 2, I think. Let me just have a look. Sorry about this, guys. Nobody's on the live stream. Okay, so rationale for requirements. Annex A. Okay, we're in Annex A and we want the... Okay, as we get through this stuff, here we go. Right. This step requires the owner to be systematic in the identification of anticipated hazards in both normal and fault conditions. So really good point. When everything is working normally, what could go wrong? So when actually the yacht could be perfectly well, but you do a jibe with somebody sitting on the boom, for example, that could be dangerous. Or fault conditions, the engine's broken, the mast is broken down, any one sort of things. So what sort of hazards have you got there? So we'll look at that. And I think these are ones that get a lot of attention. I've got onshore wind on a rocky coast. I've got no engine. You know, that's a fault condition in a very hazardous situation. And you know what? There's a good example of us describing a hazardous situation. We'll come back to it. So the hazard situation should be based on the intended use, reasonable for the foreseeable misuse, and the characteristics related to safety. Risk can only be assessed and managed once the hazardous situation has been identified. So, right, this is kind of what I said before. There's a hazard, something catching on fire, but the hazardous situation is the one that gets risk managed. You can only manage the actual situations that could come to fruition in real life as opposed to a general risk of fire, right? So there it is, reinforced, black and white. The International Standards Organization agrees, or perhaps I learned it from them. So documenting the foreseeable sequence of events that can transform a hazard into a hazardous situation allows this to be done systematically. So on your boat, if we go back to the fire example, you will have some sort of source of ignition of a fire. There'll be oxygen and there will be some sort of fuel, whether that's wood or petrol or flammable plastics, for example. So you have to work out the foreseeable events for everything on the boat where those three can come into contact and potentially start a fire, and do that systematically. So Annex C, that's the one we'll look at, aims to assist owners in identifying hazards and hazardous situations. Typical hazards are listed, and the relationships between hazards, foreseeable sequence of events, hazardous situations, and associated possible harm are demonstrated, right? So, so the typical hazards are listed, right? Relationships between hazards, foreseeable sequence of events, hazardous situations, and associated possible harm are demonstrated. So we'll come back to that. Risk estimation, we'll come back to it later. So I think what we want to do is go directly to Annex C. Let's just keep going. Right. So these are worth reading, to be honest. What we can do very, very quickly, let me just drag it in, because to buy these, they cost money. They're not free. I can't share you mine because they're all licensed. But so list the major risk management standards globally, right? So we'll just do generally. So what you can do is here, and there are websites where you can buy these things fairly cheaply. Sometimes they're $100 to $300, but there are websites where you can legally purchase these for a lot cheaper. I'm not going to say it here, but you can DM me on Instagram, for example. I'm on Yacht Prep. So what do we got? Right. ISO 3100 2018 risk management guidelines. So that's de facto. It's guidance, not a standard. Risk assessment techniques, risk management vocabulary. So that'll be some sort of like a defined terms. Enterprise risk management, probably not relevant. People cert management risks, maybe not. Don't know these ones. Financial services, not. Safety engineering, IEC 61508. IEC is generally more electronics. So we've got automotive, aviation, occupational, medical device, which we're looking at, food safety hazard. And what do we got? Continuity, project compliance. Right. So probably the general one, I think, at the top, 3100. I haven't read it. If anybody knows it, just let me know. And let's see, maritime risk management standards. Let's look for maritime risk management standards. See if we can find anything. It's being a bit slow. Gee, it's being really slow. Sorry about this, guys. skip ahead if you're watching the restream. Here we go. Right, SOLAS, okay, fine. To assess all identified risks to its ship, personnel, environment, establish appropriate safeguards. So that's legal for ISM rated ships, IMO, ISM. Ship security, that's fine. IMO formal. Here we go. The structured 5-step methodology, hazard identification, risk analysis, risk control options, cost benefit, used to develop the rules. That'll be an interesting one to dive into at some point. Cyber risk, goal-based standard, risk assessment, occupational risk assessment on board. So, I mean, they're probably worth looking at. So obviously we should be reading SOLAS at some point in our life. And as I think, maybe that's something we can do in this progress. Once we get the basic shape of our risk management together, we'll dive into some of these and look at the industry recommendations. Great. I want to see what IEC 3010 is. One second. So here we go. If you buy these things from the ISO website, that's $430. It's insane. This is why things cost so much, because it's not just it's the regulations, and I mean, this is a small cost for regulations. Selection and application techniques for assessing risk in a wide range of situations. Provide information about particular risks. Yeah, that could be interesting. And sometimes there's a sample. Again, not go into it. You can look at the sample. But yeah, this is an example where you probably wouldn't buy this for $430 unless you were a business. Yep. So they're all similar, shall we say, but same but different. So we'll carry on with this method. Right, so we were looking at how do we identify the hazardous situations. So here's a nice little flowchart. Let me just zoom in a little bit. Right, so you got the hazard, a sequence of events which lead to the hazardous situation. The hazardous situation leads to potential harm or harms, and that's actually the risk. The harm is the risk. Right. So here, I say the starting point is usually a review of experience with the same and similar type of medical devices. So that's good practice for us. We don't have to start from scratch. We can look at sources. So for example, we saw SOLAS was a source, and that can be a good source for us too. So we don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of information out there already. The review should take into account a manufacturer's own experience, so an owner's own experience in this case, for example, and where appropriate, the experience of other manufacturers as reported in adverse event databases, publication, literature, other sources, right? So in the medical field, there are public databases available which record, known adverse events. You can also find reports, government reports from the US Coast Guard, from Her Majesty's Coast Guard in the UK and all over the place. There are industry bodies we can go to, and we'll dive into some of these as well. So, we're not going to do that today. We're going to ignore the advice and begin identification of ourselves, but, we've all got our own experience. Since many hazards might never result in harm and can be eliminated from further consideration, it could be useful to perform this analysis by starting with the harm that the medical device might cause and work backwards to the hazardous situations, hazards, and initiating causes, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think the general point here is if you go cast the net too wide, you're not going to catch anything. So let's start with something is actually going to be harm. However, although this approach is useful for the reasons described, it should be recognized it's not a thorough analysis, right? So, and this is actually a really deeper point here. And again, one I try to drive home with readiness. If we only act on what we know and never try to find new sources of knowledge or new sources of potential faults in our boat or risks in our boat, we're only going to reinforce what we believe we know, which could leave a big blind spot. So the knowing is a really important part of readiness, risk management, and growing in any endeavor, especially as a yacht owner, captain, or crew. Many sequence of events will only be identified by the systematic use of risk analysis techniques. So there's a technical report which goes through some of these. So one of them, for example, is fault mode evaluation. So you work through scenarios where you have a fault, obviously the medical device or the yacht, and try and work out, what's going on. So, the engine fails, electrical system fails, the yacht, the mast falls down, and then you try and work out, the risks associated with that. Analysis and identification are further complicated by the many events and circumstances that have to be taken into consideration, such as those listed in table C2. We'll get to C2. Thus, more than one risk analysis technique, and especially complementary techniques, are often used to complete a comprehensive analysis. So again, kind of what they're driving at here is you really need to do a lot of work to challenge yourself that you've identified all the risks. Because I've seen it in this industry and I've seen in other industries, people underestimate the risk or they don't look for the risk, don't want to know the risk. Sometimes that, in a commercial setting, they don't want to admit there's a risk because it makes the product in a different risk class, makes it more expensive and harder to get registered. And yeah, unfortunately, as we get a lot of potentially, I'm not going to say what I may or may not have seen, but you get fraud when it comes to clinical trials and data, and you can search yourself. There's a lot of publicly information on that in the medical field, and we're not talking about the medical field. Although the boating industry does have its own, let's say, little peccadillos, which we need to be aware of. But regardless, us as captains, the last person we want to fool is ourselves, because we're the ones going out there. We're responsible for the boat. We're legally responsible for property and the crew. So we're the ones who end up in jail. And we don't want to be in jail, and we don't want to live with regrets for permanently ruining somebody's life because of our lack of diligence on risks on board our boats. At least I hope we don't. Thus, more than one risk analysis technique. Table C3 provides examples of relationships between hazards, sequence of events. Okay, fine. Although compilation of the list of hazards, hazardous events, and sequence of events should be completed as early as possible in the design and development process to facilitate risk control in practice. Identification compilation is an ongoing activity. Okay. So that's what you have to manage. It's an ongoing activity. Your risk list is never finished. You will always find a new risk to add. You'll have an accident, a near miss on the boat, a gap in your preparation, and you need to always come back to your risk management, your mitigations, and when it comes to readiness, to continue to look at the readiness of your boat and work on that. Right. Recognizing how hazards progress to hazardous situations is critical for estimating the probability of occurrence. So we said that before. You've got fuel. Let's say, for example, you've got like some tank of petrol next to the coal, sitting next to your coal barbecue right at the back of the boat, right? So we can imagine a bunch of different hazardous situations, not just one, where that could lead to a fire starting, right? Which then, pretty much on a boat, when a fire starts, you have some sort of harm, even if it's put out quickly. You can have some sort of damage to the boat, maybe minor burns in the most minor case. So, however, if that fuel is correctly stored and far away from any ignition source, then the probability will be a lot lower. Okay, so that's what they mean about the sequence of events can turn a hazardous situation to produce harm. Right, recognizing how hazards. We said that. is critical for estimating the probability of occurrence and severity of harm that could result, right? So a small aft deck, or let's say a small fishing boat, for example, little outboard boat, and they're barbecuing next to the you know the the fuel tank, catches fire. There's nowhere to go, right? Again, we could look at a hazard scenario where they do have a fire extinguisher on board and they don't have a fire extinguisher on board. So, these are two different scenarios. And even without a fire extinguisher, there is a world where they potentially could throw it overboard and, not things don't go further, or there could be a world where they don't get it overboard and the boat somehow burns and they're stranded, whatever. And that is, I'm not going to say which is right, which is wrong, just to point out that for sort of any sequence of events to the hazardous situation occurring and the harm, there are different paths from the hazard events occurring to different harm outcomes as well. Right, examples of hazards. C1 can be used in the identification of hazards. These are not going to be so relevant for us. Well, maybe they are. So acoustic energy, loud noises, for example. Engine room, long exposure to loud, high decibels in the engine room. There are no ear protections, so you could actually get hearing damage. That's well known. So, when we get into it, we could describe the hazardous situation working in an engine room with loud noise, no hearing protection leads to a harm. The mitigation would be to make sure you have, earmuffs, let's say ear protection in the engine room, right? Electrical energy, okay, this may be more relevant than I thought. Being electrocuted, electrical fields, leakage, magnetic fields. Yeah, I mean that could be definitely when it comes to a ship's compass. That can be static discharge, voltage. So these are all relevant for boats. Mechanical energy, kinetic energy, right? Falling objects, something falling from above, high pressured fluid injection. So, high pressure hydraulics, moving parts, a lot of moving parts on the boat, vibrating parts on the boats. So, here, I'm not sure on a kinetic energy. I guess we could probably have a crush risk as well, getting caught between a static object like the dock and a moving object like the boat, right? So mechanical energy, potential stored energy, bending, compression, cutting, shearing, suspended mass, tension, torsion. So these are things where you've got stored energy in a system and all of a sudden it snaps. So a mooring line, for example, mooring line on tension, snaps, comes back, takes somebody's eye out, for example. That could be an example of potential stored energy. Radiation energy, here, maybe radars. Don't know. I know on the Navy boats, you don't go on the roof of the destroyer because you probably get cooked with all the microwave energy. One thing I have to look into, I'm never too worried about my radar, but let's take a look at it at some point. So let's do that while we do it. And this is do the risk management, radiation energy. So let's dive into this now. Let's go to Claude and see what Claude has to say. What are subcategories of radiation energy harm from a radar on a boat? Okay, let's see how we go. Right. Direct non-ionizing marine radars, pulsed, expand, thermal effects, whole body eating, ocular, testicular, sensitive. Now, that's very interesting. Indirect contact current and induced radio frequency burns. Okay, so is this common on a private boat under 30 meters, for example? Let's find out. So the other thing too, as well, not pretending you know things when you pretending you know things when you don't know things is also not great risk management. So I'm not going to pretend. I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I don't know, and hopefully, as this group grows, we can actually source the risk analysis so we can build confidence in what we're building. Okay, mostly no. Low average power, peak power sounds alarming. Peak powers across marine radar 30 kilowatts, but average power runs 1 to 25 watts. The antenna rating, the average power within a meter of the antenna is usually under 10 watts per meter squared, even for the high power systems. Above 10 gigahertz, the energy is absorbed at the skin surface and the established adverse events, cataract, skin burns appear at densities over 1,000 watts. So probably not, but we can catch it anyhow. List the categories of hazard from radar I can use in risk analysis. Not the harm, but the hazard, the radiation. Okay. So we'll capture this and then we'll move on. Just going to drag that off the screen. So we've got non-ionizing radiation, ionizing radiation. Interesting. So let's just add electrical, mechanical, kinetic, and we can have drop, crush, stored energy. So we can have mooring line breaks under tension, for example. They've got gravitational. I'll add that there too. So mechanical, kinetic, gravitational is potential. I guess it depends. If it's a crew member falling from the mast, well, I guess that's gravitational risk, right? If it's the crew member on a deck getting hit by a spanner dropped from the top of the mast, I guess that's mechanical, kinetic. Right, okay, here we go. It's getting good. Thermal, burns, chemical. Right, okay. Electromagnetic interference. Here we go. Look at all the hazards. Look how dangerous boating is. Okay, so 1 second. I just want to put this. That didn't work. Right. So I just want to put a note on Instagram. I think it's very unlikely we're going to get any users. Sorry, any viewers on the first stream. I have to work on that. Okay, MB. Okay, let's see if we get one person on the stream. Okay, so you can see here, for example, just on that little prompt, we start to build out already. I'm sure your mind is popping with ideas. I know mine is on all the different risks we need to manage when we're on a boat. And I think it just reinforces boats. You know, if you wanted time and money, you wouldn't go buy a boat. But there's something about having a boat that we're willing to do all the work so we have a great time on the water. And this is some of the work we do on the shore. Right, so let's get back to the ISO, see what we've got. So we've got ionizing radiation, non-ionizing, so we've got that there. We'll dive that later. Infrared, laser, microwave, ultraviolet, thermal energy, biological agents, bacteria, fungi, parasites, prions, toxins, viruses. Yeah, I mean, that can be there. Bacteria in our diesel, the diesel bug, for example, that's one. Bugs in our drinking water is also another. It can cause health issues. One's health of our engine, the other one's health of the crew on board. So that's definitely it. Chemical agents, carcinogenic, mutagenic, reproductive, caustic, corrosive, flammable, combustible, explosive, fumes, vapor, osmotic, particles, pyrogenic, solvents, toxic. So all of those are pretty relevant for a boat, I would say. Immunological agents, antiseptic substances, latex, immunosuppressive, irritants, sensitizing. I'm sure we can find some of those effects on the boat, no doubt. Data, access to data, availability of data, confidentiality, transfer integrity. That could be anything from the code to unlock, I know, the the number padlock for your life raft or dinghy, for example. That code is data. Could be crew with a medical condition that's been given to you, and you leave a form or something around the in the boat so everybody gets to see it. These sort of things. So data more and more in boating is important. Delivery, that's more like, we'll ignore that one. Diagnostic, functionality. Yeah, okay, this is good. Alarms on every boat. Sorry, lots of mosquitoes at the moment. Um, Alarms is really important. So, for example, on my boat, the pre-start alarm, there should be a light and there should be a loud buzzing sound, is not working. So that's a problem. The engine does seem to work, but I need to get that fixed. That's one example. But alarms which are in a fault condition or don't warn us when they should be warning us is important. I also had another one where I was coming from the west coast of Scotland back to the Netherlands, and I was in a channel on the east coast of England, and all of a sudden I noticed I had no oil pressure. I was in a channel, like it was rough, it was windy. I had to shut down the engine quickly and just take a look at what was going on. I couldn't see any problem. I couldn't see oil leaks, you name it. I just had an oil service, filter replaced, and I had previously had an oil leak. I was worried about that. And luckily, I could get the mechanic who serviced my engine on the phone, and he said, "Look, check the wires." So check the wires, and it was really just a sensor issue. Just had to put the wire back in. I had oil pressure again, and not a problem. So yeah, fault condition. I know a oil gauge is not an alarm, but it's definitely an indicator of the health. So that's really important. So I think as we get through this, we're going to have really good time finding a whole bunch of very interesting risks and a whole bunch of probably well-established mitigations for that risk. Examples of events and circumstances. In order to identify a foreseeable sequence of events, it's often useful to consider events and circumstances that can cause them. Table C2 provides examples of events and circumstances organized into general categories. Although the list is certainly not exhaustive, it is intended to demonstrate, yep, okay, fine. So, requirements. Okay, this could be nice. Now, usually this is around the design of the product. Potentially it could be around the design of the boat. Marchage, Marchag, has got a great book about design faults in the famous Fastnet, was it 73, 74, where the storm came through. So inadequate specification, design parameters, operating parameters, performance requirements, in-service requirements, end of life. These are definitely relevant somehow. Manufacturing process, insufficient control of manufacturing processes, materials, material compatibility, subcontractors. Again, this is really talking about the manufacturing of the device, but I mean, it could be a defect in your boat. I think we've seen those videos of boats with the incorrect balance rolling over at launch in the worst case, or you could get, Benettos apparently have a reputation, allegedly have a reputation for the keels falling off. It's a modern construction method of bolting, very important part of the boat to the bottom of the boat. So putting a lot of stress on, just a small number of bolts. So, that could be defective. It could be service work you get done, repair work you get done that's faulty. So this is all very important. Transport and storage, that's more warehousing. We can maybe ignore that somewhat, although it could be transport or storage of things on the boat. Filters in their original plastic packaging, flares in their original packaging and stored, appropriately. Sorry, it's getting late and flies are being attracted to the light. So, get the fan there. Okay. All right, what else we got? Environmental factors, physical, heat, pressure, time. Definitely, if you're in an area with UV on a fiberglass boat, that can potentially be damaging. Chemical factors, corrosion, degradation, whatever. And I think for us, environmental factors, if you think of anodes on the boat, whether your anodes are the right type for the water you're in, whether it's fresh or salt water, for example. Electromagnetic fields, inadequate. Okay. I'm just going to skip through some of these. You could probably argue that some of these are relevant, but they're a bit more finer examples. What else we got here? Okay, here we got some examples. So the hazard, electromagnetic energy, high voltage, foreseeable sequence of events, electrode cable unintentionally plugged into power line receptacle. So line has this situation, line voltage appears on electrodes. So an electrode is not meant to have high voltage down it. They accidentally plug it into, 240 volts, and they place that electrode on a patient. They could, kill them, right? Serious burns, heart fibrillation, for example. So that's one example. Now, obviously, this is why we have different plug sizes for different outlets, and that's all standardized. So hopefully we're never in a situation where an electrode can be plugged into a high voltage power line. Chemical, incomplete removal of volatile solvent used in manufacturing. Solvent residue converts to gas at body temperature. So these are the sequence of events. See, we've got the numbers here, 1, 2, 3, and that's really important. We'll see that as we get into the risk analysis. We got biological functionality. Yeah, a lot of these are very, very medical. So, how long have we been going now? Can I tell? Oh, I'm not sure I can tell. Well, what we might do is start wrapping up and we try and do one example. So I'll tell you what, that's where we're going to start next time. We're going to start with the hazardous situation. This is the first one. Okay, no viewers. I guess that's to be expected. And we will, hopefully somebody views this, but this is how streaming starts. And hopefully we'll see you on the next one and we'll build this list out. Like I said, if you see this and you want access, there's a link in the chat. Just request access and I'll approve it. And I will let you know. I'll probably do another stream tomorrow night. Okay. See you guys.